the air in the Miller & Sons. John Deere dealership hung thick and heavy, a sterile mix of fresh green paint, new rubber, and Stan Miller's cloying cologne. It was the smell of progress, he called it. The smell of money. To Arthur Jensen, it smelled like a trap. He stood by the parts counter, a small, greasy water pump gasket in his calloused hand, feeling about as welcome as a fox in a henhouse. Across the gleaming, waxed floor, under spotlights that made everything look like it was on a game show, sat the real reason for the buzz in the room. A brand new John Deere 4840, a behemoth of a tractor, its sound guard cab looking more like a spaceship cockpit than a place to work. Its tires were taller than Art's son, and its price tag, he knew, was more than his father had paid for their entire 240-acre farm back in '48. In the center of the spectacle was Frank Thompson, his neighbor to the west. Frank was signing a stack of papers on Stan Miller's polished oak desk, a wide, foolish grin plastered on his face. Stan, all slicked back hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, clapped Frank on the back. "You're making the smartest move of your life, Frank," Stan said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the showroom to hear. "Power. Efficiency. This 4840 will pay for itself in 2 seasons, guaranteed. You can't afford not to upgrade in times like these." Art just shook his head, turning back to the parts counter where a young kid with acne and a green polo shirt was trying to figure out the cash register. Art's tractor, a 1968 John Deere 4020, was parked outside. It wasn't pretty. The green paint was faded to a dull olive on the hood, scarred by 100 encounters with fence posts and tree branches. The fenders were dented, and a patch of Bondo covered a rust spot near the battery box. But Art knew every nut and bolt on that machine. He'd rebuilt the diesel engine himself 5 years ago, overhauled the synchro-range transmission the winter before last. It didn't have a cab, just a canvas heat houser for the winter and the open air for the summer. It owed him nothing, and he owed nobody for it. That was a feeling Art wouldn't trade for all the air-conditioned cabs in the county. "That'll be $4.72, Mr. Jensen," the kid said. Art pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket, the crease in the denim of his jeans pale from years of carrying it. As he counted out the bills, Stan Miller swaggered over, leaving Frank to admire his new iron. Art, Stan said, shaking his head with mock pity. "Still trying to hold that old 4020 together with baling wire and hope? I saw you pull in. Things blowing more smoke than a freight train." "Just needs a little tuning, Stan," Art said evenly, not looking up from his money. "She runs fine." "Fine isn't going to cut it anymore," Stan said, leaning an elbow on the counter. He gestured with his thumb toward Frank and the new tractor. "That's the future. Frank's picking up another 80 acres next to you. With that 4840 and a 24-foot disc, he'll have it worked down before you can even get your old 14-foot cultivator unfolded." Art pocketed his change and the small paper bag with the gasket. He looked at Stan, then over at Frank, who was now sitting in the driver's seat of the 4840, fiddling with the controls like a kid with a new toy. Art could see the numbers spinning in his head. The tractor loan, the new land loan, the operating note for seed and fertilizer that would have to be bigger than ever. He'd heard from the boys at the co-op that Frank's total line of credit with the bank was pushing $150,000, an astronomical sum, a weight that would crush a man. "Frank's a good farmer," Art said, his voice low. "I hope it works out for him." Stan laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Hope? Art, this isn't about hope. It's about leverage. It's about using the bank's money to get ahead. You know, inflation's running at 10%. He's practically getting this money for free. You're sitting on that paid-for land of yours like a mother hen on a glass egg, afraid to move. You could be somebody. You could be farming 1,000 acres by now." Art's jaw tightened. He'd heard this speech 100 times, at the diner, at the feed mill, and especially here. The gospel of debt, preached by its most fervent disciple. He looked Stan square in the eye. He saw the expensive watch, the perfectly pressed shirt, the soft hands that hadn't held a wrench in years, if ever. Then he looked past him, at the mountain of green steel that represented a lifetime of payments for his neighbor. A slow, deliberate calm settled over Art. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "You know, Stan, you might be right," he said, his voice just loud enough to carry. "I've been thinking about all this debt, and I've made a decision." Stan's eyes lit up. He straightened his tie, sensing a sale. "Attaboy, Art! Now you're talking. We can get you in a Ford 440, easy. Your 4020 is a classic. We'll give you a fair trade." Art held up a hand, stopping him cold. He looked at the $5 bill he'd just used to pay for his part, then back at Stan. "Yeah," Art said, a dry, humorless smile touching the corner of his mouth. "I think I'll pay off my $150,000 today." Stan's face contorted in confusion. "What? What are you talking about? You don't have a note that big." Art tapped the small paper bag in his hand. "I'm going to pay it off by going home, putting this $4 gasket in a tractor I own outright, and farming land that belongs to me, not the bank. I'm going to pay it off by not signing a single one of those papers you've got Frank tangled up in." For a second, there was silence. The kid behind the counter froze. Then Stan's face broke into a loud, booming laugh. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was sharp and dismissive. Frank, hearing the commotion, climbed down from his new throne and walked over, a confused look on his face. "What's so funny?" Frank asked. "Art here," Stan choked out, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "He's telling us his grand financial plan. He's going to pay off a debt he doesn't have by staying small, by staying broke." Frank looked at Art, a mixture of pity and condescension in his eyes. "Art, you got to get with the times. My dad thought like that. Look where it got him. Broke his back on 80 acres his whole life. You got to expand or die." Art just looked at the two of them, standing there in the artificial light, smelling of new plastic and easy credit. He didn't say another word. He just gave a slight nod, turned, and walked out the big glass doors into the bright, honest sunlight. The sound of their laughter followed him across the gravel lot. He didn't look back. He climbed up onto the familiar, cracked vinyl seat of his 4020, the steel hot from the afternoon sun. He turned the key, and the old diesel engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life with a column of dark smoke that quickly cleared to a steady, rhythmic haze. The sound was a deep, guttural thrum he knew better than his own heartbeat. It was the sound of solvency, the sound of freedom. "Before we go any further, I gotta ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like Art? Someone who stuck to the old ways when everyone else was chasing the new thing? Or maybe you knew a Stan, pushing everyone to borrow and expand? Let me know down in the comments which one you've seen more of in your life. It tells a lot about the times we've lived through. Back on the Jensen farm, the laughter from the dealership faded into the familiar rumble of the 4020's engine. Art pulled into the packed dirt yard in front of his machine shed, a long, pole-frame building with faded red paint and a tin roof that glowed silver in the sun. The place was neat, but not sterile. Tools hung on the walls in their proper places, outlines drawn in black paint so you knew where everything went. An old International 1206, its white paint peeling around the exhaust stack, sat next to a rusty but sound Farmel M that was mostly used for raking hay and running the grain auger. This was Art's kingdom, a museum of functional, paid-for history. He killed the engine on the 40C20, and the sudden silence was filled with the chirping of sparrows in the rafters. The smell of hot diesel and dust filled his nostrils. He sat for a moment, his hands resting on the worn steering wheel, the words of Stan and Frank echoing in his head. Expand or die. Get with the times. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was just a stubborn fool, clinging to a past that was gone for good. He looked at his hands, the knuckles swollen, the skin cracked and permanently stained with grease and earth. These were not the hands of a man who signed papers at a desk. These were the hands of a man who did the work. With a sigh, he swung himself down from the tractor. Time to get that water pump fixed. Procrastination was a luxury he couldn't afford. Inside the shed, he grabbed his big roll-around toolbox and wheeled it over to the front of the 4020. The job was straightforward, but messy. First, he placed a 5-gallon bucket under the radiator petcock and opened it. A stream of green antifreeze, still good, gurgled into the bucket. He'd filter it through a cheesecloth and put it right back in when he was done. Waste not, want not. While it drained, he started loosening the fan belt, using a long 1/2-inch breaker bar to release the tension on the alternator bracket. The bolts were tight, frozen by years of heat cycles and dirt. It took all his weight, his boots slipping on the oily concrete floor, to break them free with a sharp crack. He removed the fan shroud and the fan itself, carefully laying the bolts in a magnetic tray so they wouldn't get lost. Now for the pump. It was held on by 4 bolts. 2 were easy to get to. The other 2 were tucked in, behind the front mount hydraulic pump, a classic John Deere design that was both brilliant and infuriating. He had to use a combination of a universal joint, a 6-inch extension, and a well-worn socket to reach the bottom bolt. His knuckles scraped against the greasy engine block, drawing a thin line of blood he didn't even notice. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, each movement practiced and sure. He knew this machine. He knew the precise amount of force to use before a bolt would strip or snap. He knew the feel of a bearing that was starting to go, the subtle change in pitch of an engine that meant the injectors needed cleaning. Finally, with a grunt, the last bolt came free. The water pump was loose, but it was held fast by the old gasket and a decade of corrosion. He took a small pry bar and gently worked it into the seam, careful not to gouge the soft cast iron of the engine block. With a sucking sound, it broke free, spilling the last of its coolant onto the floor. He carried the heavy iron casting over to his workbench, its surface caked in a mixture of dirt, oil, and chaff. He clamped it in his big bench vise and began to scrape the old gasket material off the mating surface with a razor blade. This was the most critical part. If the surface wasn't perfectly clean and smooth, the new gasket would never seal properly, and he'd be doing this job all over again in a month. He worked slowly, meticulously, the scrape of the blade the only sound in the quiet shed. He could have bought a whole new pump from Stan for $60. It would have saved him 2 hours of work. But $60 was $60. It was a week's worth of groceries for him and his wife, Sarah. It was 2 bags of seed corn. It was fuel for the tractor. And besides, there was nothing wrong with the pump itself. The bearings felt smooth, and the impeller was solid. It was just a $4 gasket that had failed. To throw away a perfectly good part for the sake of convenience felt like a sin. As he worked, his mind drifted back to his father, a man who had farmed this same land with a John Deere Model A and a team of Belgians before that. His father had taught him to be a steward, not just of the land, but of the machinery. "This tractor is your partner, Arthur," he used to say, his voice thick with a Danish accent. "You take care of her, she takes care of you. Never owe the bank for a tool you need to make a living. The interest will eat you alive." It was a lesson the new generation, men like Frank Thompson, seemed to have forgotten. They saw debt as a tool. Art saw it as a chain. Once the surface was clean, he wiped it down with a rag soaked in mineral spirits until it shone. He took the new gasket from its paper bag, coated both sides with a thin, tacky layer of Permatex sealant, and carefully placed it on the pump. He let it sit for a few minutes to get tacky. Then he hoisted the heavy pump back into place on the engine, painstakingly starting each bolt by hand to ensure he didn't cross-thread them. He tightened them in a star pattern, a quarter turn at a time, until they were snug. Then he reattached the fan, the shroud, and the belt, tensioning it just right, not so tight it would wear out the bearings, not so loose it would slip. He poured the old antifreeze back into the radiator, his big funnel catching every drop. When it was full, he climbed back onto the seat, turned the key, and the 40-20 fired up again. He let it run for 10 minutes, his eyes scanning the new gasket for any sign of a leak. It was bone dry. A small smile of satisfaction touched his lips. It was a victory. A small one, maybe, in the grand scheme of things. But it was his, earned with his own 2 hands. He had saved $60, and in doing so, had pushed back against the world of Stan Miller just a little bit. The late 1970s rolled on, and the world seemed to prove Art wrong, and Stan Miller right. The boom was on. Russian grain deals, soaring exports, and rampant inflation sent commodity prices through the roof. A bushel of corn was fetching prices no one had ever dreamed of. Land values doubled, and then doubled again. Farmers who had been cautious their whole lives were suddenly millionaires on paper. The banks, flush with cash from oil-rich nations, were practically giving money away. Operating loans were handed out with a smile and a handshake. The change in the county was palpable. New pickups, shiny and clean, replaced the old dented farm trucks at the diner. Wives who had always kept the books and driven the grain truck were now seen driving new station wagons into town. And everywhere, you could hear the roar of new, bigger machinery. Frank Thompson was the poster child for the new era. The 4840 was just the beginning. The next year, he traded his 6-row planter for a brand new 12-row John Deere Max Emerge, a planter so wide it had to be folded up to go down the road. He bought a new Gleaner combine with an 8-row corn head that could harvest in a day what used to take Art a week. He bought the 80 acres next to Art, and then another 160 on the other side. He tore out the old fence rows, filled in the grass waterways, and ploughed up pastures that had been in sod for 50 years. His fields were vast, unbroken expanses of black dirt, stretching from road to road. Stan Miller's dealership became the social hub of the county. On rainy days, the showroom was packed with farmers drinking free coffee, talking about yields and land prices, and dreaming up new ways to spend the bank's money. Stan would walk among them, a king in his court, signing deals on cocktail napkins. He sold more iron in 1978 than his father had sold in the entire decade of the 60s. He was hailed as a genius, a visionary who saw the future of agriculture. Art Jensen, meanwhile, became a local curiosity, a relic. He kept farming his 240 acres, no more, no less. He still drove his 40-20. He still used his 6-row planter, which meant his fields were laced with the grassy headlands he needed to turn around in. The other farmers would drive by and shake their heads. "Poor old Art," they'd say at the co-op, sitting on a gold mine and refusing to dig. That land of his is worth $3,000 an acre now. He could borrow against it, buy another 500 acres, and really make some money. The pressure was immense. Even his wife, Sarah, a steady and practical woman, began to have her doubts. "Art, maybe we should just buy that 40 acres from the Henderson estate," she said one night at the kitchen table after she'd come back from town. "Everyone is doing it. It feels like we're being left behind." Art looked up from his ledger. His books were simple. A column for income, a column for expenses. At the bottom of the page was a number, written in black ink. It wasn't a huge number, but it was always positive. "Sarah," he said gently, "what we have is real. It's ours. The money everyone else is making. It's not real. It's paper money. It's bank money. It's built on the idea that prices will only ever go up. Nothing goes up forever." He took the profits from the high grain prices and did the unthinkable. He paid off the farm. He'd been making double payments on the mortgage for years, and in the fall of 1979, he drove into town and handed the banker the final check. There was no ceremony, no champagne. The banker, a young man who was used to writing new loans, not closing old ones, looked at him with a puzzled expression, as if he couldn't comprehend why someone would want to be free of debt. Instead of buying new machinery, Art invested in his old iron. He found a used John Deere 7000 6-row planter, a newer model than his old one, and spent the winter rebuilding it from the ground up, replacing every chain, bearing and seed tube. He put new tires on his International 1206. He rebuilt the engine on the old Farmall M himself, honing the cylinders and fitting new rings and pistons, the smell of engine enamel filling the shed for a week. To everyone else, it looked like he was going backward. To Art, it felt like he was building a fortress. One evening in late autumn, Art was standing on his back porch, watching the sun set over his fields of corn stubble. The air was crisp and carried the scent of wood smoke from his chimney. In the distance, across the fence line that he'd refused to tear out, he could see the bright halogen lights of Frank Thompson's newest toy, a massive, articulated John Deere 8640 four-wheel drive tractor pulling a giant chisel plough. The deep, guttural roar of its engine carried across the quiet fields, a sound that went on long after the sun had disappeared, often past midnight. It was the sound of the boom, the sound of progress, the sound of debt. Art went inside. The television was on, and a serious-looking news anchor was talking. Art only caught a few words. The Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker, announced another increase in the federal funds rate today in a continued effort to combat runaway inflation. Interest rates for borrowers are expected to climb into the high teens. Sarah was knitting in her chair by the fire. She looked up at him, a worried line creasing her brow. "Did you hear that, Art? High teens. Can you imagine?" Art stood there, listening to the distant, relentless growl of Frank's tractor. He thought of the stacks of paper his neighbor had signed, the variable interest rates that were surely written in the fine print. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The sound of that big tractor didn't sound like progress anymore. It sounded like a countdown. The high, pleasant hum of the good times was changing, dropping into a lower, more menacing frequency. The taut wire that had been humming for years was beginning to vibrate, ready to snap. The summer of 1980 arrived like a fever. The sky bleached to a hazy, indifferent white, and the rains simply stopped. By July, the corn in Art's fields, which should have been shoulder-high and dark green, stood stunted and pale, its leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, a desperate attempt to conserve what little moisture remained. The ground, once soft and black, hardened into a concrete-like crust, webbed with deep cracks that looked like jagged scars. The air grew still and heavy, carrying the scent of dust and withered crops. The mood in the county soured with the weather. At the co-op, the boisterous talk of land prices and new equipment was gone, replaced by hushed, anxious conversations in the corners. The news from the television was a relentless drumbeat of bad tidings. The president had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union, and the bottom fell out of the market overnight. Corn that had been selling for over $3 a bushel was now struggling to fetch $2. At the same time, those words from the nightly news anchor a year ago had become a terrifying reality. The prime interest rate, the number that governed every farmer's operating loan, was climbing like a rocket. 15%, then 18%, then an unthinkable 21%. One blistering afternoon, Art was cultivating his soybeans, the old 6-row cultivator kicking up clouds of fine, choking dust. The 40-20, hot but steady, rumbled along, its wide front tires parting the struggling plants. As he reached the end of a row, he saw a plume of black smoke billow up from Frank Thompson's property, followed by the abrupt silence of a massive engine shutting down. A few minutes later, Frank's pickup truck came barreling down the gravel road, spitting rocks, heading toward town. Later that evening, Art saw the service truck from Miller & Son's John Deere parked in Frank's yard, its yellow beacon flashing in the twilight. He watched for a while from his own porch as two mechanics in green uniforms worked under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, their figures small and ant-like beside the enormous articulated frame of Frank's 8640. The next day, Art saw Frank at the feed mill. Frank's face was drawn and pale under his tan, and his eyes were bloodshot. "Hydraulic pump went out," Frank said, his voice a low rasp. He didn't wait for Art to ask. "The main one. Took out half the lines with it when it grenaded. Stan's got a man working on it, but the pump's a special order. Has to come from Waterloo. Might be a week." Art nodded slowly. "Tough break, especially right now." Frank let out a short, bitter laugh. "Tough break? Stan gave me the estimate this morning. $4,000. $4,000 for one part, and the labor to put it in. And every day that thing sits, my beans are getting choked with weeds. I'm paying 20% interest on a tractor I can't even use." He kicked at a loose stone on the ground, his frustration and fear a palpable thing. "Should have traded it last year when Stan wanted me to. Got into the new 8650. Would have had a warranty." Art didn't say anything. He knew that trading it would have just meant a bigger loan, a higher payment, a deeper hole. He saw Stan Miller a few days later, gassing up his Lincoln Continental at the station in town. The slick, confident smile was gone, replaced by a tight, forced grimace. His hair seemed a little less perfect, his suit a little less pressed. "Heard you're having trouble getting parts," Art said, making conversation as he filled a 5-gallon can with diesel. Stan scowled, shoving the nozzle into his car with more force than necessary. "The whole supply chain is a mess, and nobody's paying their bills. I've got $500,000 in accounts receivable, and every farmer in the county is telling me to wait till harvest." "What harvest? Look at the sky, Art. There's nothing out there." He gestured at his dealership across the road. The lot was still packed with gleaming new tractors and combines, unsold monuments to a boom that had suddenly gone bust. "Got 3 brand new 4840s sitting there. A year ago, I had a waiting list for them. Now, I couldn't sell one if I offered it for half price. Everyone's broke." The easy confidence was gone, replaced by the raw, brittle edge of panic. Stan Miller, the preacher of the gospel of debt, was being crucified on a cross of his own making. He had leveraged everything, assuming the good times would last forever. Now, the wire had snapped. Art finished filling his can, paid the man inside, and drove home. He didn't feel any satisfaction, no sense of vindication. He just felt a profound sadness. He looked at his own fields, thirsty and struggling, and knew that he would be lucky to break even this year. But breaking even was a world away from where Frank Thompson and Stan Miller were. Art's fortress, built of old iron and paid for land, was holding. The storm was raging outside his walls, and he was watching his neighbors drown. The fall of 1981 was a season of ghosts. The harvest was a disaster, with yields down by a third across the county due to the drought. The price of corn and soybeans remained stubbornly, ruinously low. The air, which should have been filled with the drone of combines and the cheerful roar of grain dryers, was eerily quiet. Many farmers, unable to get the financing to even buy fuel, simply left their crops to rot in the fields. For sale signs began to sprout along the county roads like bitter weeds. Not the small, handwritten signs of a farmer retiring, but large, professionally printed signs from banks and auction companies. They were tacked to fence posts in front of farmhouses where families had lived for generations. The word foreclosure, once a whispered shame from the time of the Great Depression, was now a common and brutal reality. One crisp October morning, a letter arrived for Frank Thompson. It wasn't in a friendly local bank envelope. It came in a long, sterile window envelope from a corporate office in Des Moines. His wife found him in the machine shed, staring at the single sheet of paper, his face the color of ash. The letter was polite, professional, and utterly ruthless. It informed him that due to non-payment, his entire line of credit, totaling over $300,000, was being called due. He had 30 days to remit the full amount, or liquidation proceedings would begin. 30 days. It was a death sentence. He had no cash. The value of his land had plummeted, so he had no equity to borrow against. His machinery, bought at the peak of the market, was now worth less than half what he owed on it. He was trapped. The leverage that Stan Miller had promised would make him rich had become a lead weight, pulling him under. The downfall was swift and merciless. The bank didn't even wait the full 30 days. 2 weeks later, a pair of grim-faced men in cheap suits arrived in a sedan, accompanied by a flatbed truck. They presented Frank with another set of papers and proceeded to repossess the 8640 and the big Gleaner combine. Frank didn't protest. He just stood in his yard, his shoulders slumped, and watched as the machines he had staked his future on were chained down and hauled away like scrap. Stan Miller's empire crumbled just as quickly. With dozens of his customers defaulting, he couldn't make the massive payments on his own floor plan, the financing that allowed him to stock his inventory. John Deere Corporate, as unsentimental as any bank, locked the gates. The big green sign on the highway that had been a beacon of progress was covered with a canvas tarp. The showroom, once a bustling hub of optimism, was now dark and empty, the ghosts of easy credit and foolish dreams echoing in the silence. Through it all, Art Jensen's life continued in its steady, quiet rhythm. The drought had hurt him, but it hadn't broken him. His expenses were a fraction of his neighbors. He didn't have a $4,000 repair bill. He didn't have a 21% interest payment. His biggest outlay for the fall was a set of new sickle sections for his old John Deere 42400 combine, a machine he'd bought for cash at a farm sale 5 years earlier. One afternoon, he was in his shed, methodically replacing the sections, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his hammer and punch echoing in the cool air. His hands, steady and sure, worked with a familiar grace. He was so focused on his task that he didn't hear the pickup truck pull into the yard. "Art?" The voice was quiet, hesitant. Art looked up. It was Frank Thompson. He looked 10 years older than he had a year ago. His clothes were clean but hung loosely on his thinned frame. "Frank," Art said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "Come on in." Frank stepped into the shed, his eyes darting around at the collection of old, well-maintained machinery. He looked at the 4020, its faded paint seeming to glow in the afternoon light. "Heard they came and got your combine," Art said gently. Frank nodded, not meeting Art's gaze. He stared at the concrete floor. "Yeah, they did. My corn's still standing out there. All 150 acres of it." His voice cracked. "The bank won't give me the money for fuel to run the old one, even if it was working. It's over, Art. They're selling everything. The land, the house, everything." The two men stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the chirping of sparrows in the rafters. Art thought of the laughter in the dealership years ago. Expand or die. It turned out there was a third option: survive. Art walked over to his workbench and picked up a wrench. He looked at the combine part in his hand, then at his defeated neighbor. "My beans are done," Art said, his voice even. "I was going to start on my corn tomorrow. The tank on the 4400 holds about 100 bushels. It's not fast, but it works. And my diesel tank is full." Frank looked up, his eyes glassy with confusion. What are you saying?" "I'm saying that corn isn't going to pick itself," Art said, turning back to his work. "You can drive the grain truck. We can probably get yours done in 4 or 5 days if the weather holds. We'll do mine after." Frank stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. He looked from Art to the old small combine, then back to Art. He seemed to be trying to find the catch, the angle. There wasn't one. This wasn't a business transaction. It was what neighbors did. It was a code that the new world of high finance and leveraged assets had tried, and failed, to erase. A single tear traced a path through the dust on Frank's cheek. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and gave a shaky nod. "Okay, Art," he whispered. "Okay." The day of the Thompson Farm auction was cold and grey, with a sky the colour of lead. A bitter wind whipped across the barren fields, chilling the small crowd of farmers who had gathered in Frank's yard. They stood in grim or silent clusters, their hands shoved deep in their pockets, their faces etched with a mixture of sympathy and fear. Each man there knew that. But for the grace of God or the signature on a different loan document, it could be his own life's work being sold off piece by piece. Frank and his wife stood on the porch of their home, watching the proceedings with a stony, vacant numbness. The auctioneer, a man with a forced, booming voice, tried to inject some energy into the funereal atmosphere, but his calls fell flat. The bidding was sparse and low. A lifetime of accumulation, tools, livestock feeders, grain wagons, was sold off in a matter of hours for a fraction of its worth. Then came the big iron. The 12-row planter, the one Frank had been so proud of, sold for less than the price of a new pickup truck. The massive chisel plow went to an out-of-state salvage dealer. Art stood at the back of the crowd, a silent observer. He felt no triumph, only a deep, hollowing sorrow for what had been lost. Finally, the auctioneer turned his attention to the land. They sold it in parcels. The home 80, with the house and buildings, went first. Then another 160. Art watched, his jaw tight. Then the auctioneer called out the last parcel. "All right, folks, next up we have a prime piece of ground. 80 acres, lays flat, good black dirt all the way through. It's the old Henderson place, right along the road here. What'll you give me for it?" Art's heart gave a thump. This was the land that bordered his own farm, the first piece Frank had bought in his quest to expand. He thought of the fence row Frank had torn out, the waterway he had filled in. The bidding started low. A corporate farm from the next county made a bid. A local investor countered. The price crept up slowly, but stalled out well below what the land had been worth just 2 years prior. The bank representative, a young man in a suit who looked miserable to be there, conferred with the auctioneer. The auctioneer raised his gavel. "Going once, going twice." Art raised his hand. His voice was clear and steady, cutting through the murmuring crowd. He called out a number, $5,000 higher than the last bid. It was a fair price. It was also nearly every dollar of savings he and Sarah had in the world. A hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to him. The corporate buyer shook his head. The investor shrugged. They were looking for a bargain, and Art had just set a floor based on respect, not desperation. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking down like a rifle shot. "To Arthur Jensen." After the auction was over, as the crowd dispersed and the last of the trucks pulled away, Art saw Frank walking toward him. He braced himself, not knowing what to expect. Anger, resentment, bitterness. Frank stopped a few feet away. His eyes were clear, the haunted, panicked look finally gone, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. "You didn't have to do that, Art," he said, his voice quiet. "You didn't have to bid it up. They would have sold it for less." "It's good land, Frank," Art replied simply. "It's worth a fair price." Frank looked out over the empty field, the field that was now Art's. "I heard you paid off your mortgage a few years back, right before the end." "That's right." Frank shook his head slowly, a wry, humorless smile touching his lips. He finally looked Art in the eye. "You were right. All this time, Stan and I, all of us, we were laughing at you. We called you an old fool, afraid to take a chance. Turns out we were the fools. We were building our houses on sand, and you were sitting on solid rock." He extended a rough, calloused hand. "Congratulations, Art. You take care of that land." Art took his hand and shook it firmly. "I'll need a hand putting up fence this spring," Art said. "Good pay for a good man if you're looking for work." It was an offer of a job, but it was also an offer of dignity. Frank's eyes welled up, and he just nodded, unable to speak. He turned and walked back toward the house that would be his for only a few more days. Art's vindication was complete. It was quiet, it was somber, and it tasted not of victory, but of survival. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The community healed slowly. Some farmers, like Frank, lost everything and moved away. Others managed to hold on by the skin of their teeth, their operations smaller, their ambitions humbled. The perspective shifted. Suddenly, having a 20-year-old tractor that was paid for wasn't a sign of failure, it was a badge of honor. Debt, once seen as a sophisticated tool, was now spoken of with the caution and respect one affords a coiled rattlesnake. Art became an unlikely elder statesman. Younger farmers, the ones who had survived the crash, would stop by his machine shed. They wouldn't ask about leveraging assets or cash flow projections. They would ask him how to rebuild a hydraulic cylinder, or how to set the timing on an old diesel engine, or how he managed to make a living on just 320 acres. He would show them, patiently explaining the mechanics of a machine or the simple economics of spending less than you earn. He never once said, "I told you so." He never had to. One Saturday afternoon, in the late summer of 1989, Art, now a man in his late 60s, with more grey in his hair and deeper lines around his eyes, stood in that same machine shed. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating the familiar shapes of his iron kingdom. His son, David, now a grown man with a family of his own, was working beside him, tightening the bolts on a freshly rebuilt water pump. It was the very same pump from the 4020. "You know," David said, wiping sweat from his brow, "we could have just bought a new one for $80. Art smiled. And what would we have learned from that? He looked over at his grandson, a boy of 10, who was carefully cleaning a greasy part with a rag, his face a mask of concentration. Art walked over and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. The boy looked up at him, his eyes bright with curiosity. "See this tractor?" Art said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "This was my father's philosophy, and his father's before him. This machine is your partner. It's a tool, not a status symbol. You take care of her, she'll take care of you. You learn her sounds, you learn her weaknesses, and you learn how to fix her with your own 2 hands. And you never, ever owe the bank for a tool you need to make a living. That's a freedom that no amount of money can buy." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old, worn leather wallet he'd carried for 40 years. From it, he took a small, folded piece of paper, a receipt. It was faded and soft, the print barely legible. It was from Miller & Sons John Deere, dated over a decade ago. For 1 water pump gasket, price $4.72. He handed it to the boy. "This," he said, "was the best investment I ever made." A moment later, David climbed onto the cracked vinyl seat of the 4020. He turned the key. The old diesel engine coughed once, twice, and then roared to life, settling into the deep, familiar, rhythmic thrum that had been the soundtrack to Art Jensen's life. It was the sound of solvency. It was the sound of endurance. It was the sound of a legacy, passed down through generations, as solid and enduring as the land itself,